Hello and welcome to the Oasis Tracer User Creation course. This course is geared towards Oasis Tracer system administrators and is focused on the creation and doling out of permissions for your various user types. More specifically in this class, we'll be covering the following topics. First and foremost, we'll be talking about an Active Directory configuration. For those organizations that leverage Active Directory for the maintenance of your user profiles, Oasis Tracer version 7 and beyond can now directly sync in with Active Directory to ease the maintenance and creation of your user profiles. Once we take a look at that configuration, the next major topic that we'll discuss is the creation of lists and call filters. Lists and call filters are groupings that can be created in the software to properly allocate permissions to calls. So, if you want your customer service manager to listen to the customer service calls, and the sales manager to listen to the sales calls, we can go into the software and define those groupings to properly give permissions to those individuals. Once we take a look at that little logistical pre-step of creating groups in the software, the next major topic will be the actual creation of user profiles, wherein we'll create generic shell profiles for all of the people in your company that should have access to the Tracer software, so that way we can go about the process of granting them very specific permissions. Also in that discussion, I'm going to introduce the concept of user groups, which are a great little administrative utility that you can use to assign identical permissions to like users within your software. It's a nice little time saver piece wherein you can in one fell swoop assign identical permissions to similar people in the software without having to individually go back to each person's profile and grant them permissions to the software. Then last but not least, we're going to take on that granular process of setting those specific profile permissions so that your employees can do exactly what you want them to do in the software, and more importantly, not do what it is that you don't want them to do inside of the Tracer software. Once that's all complete, you'll be able to go back to your system, create user profiles for all of your various employees, and have them start working with it in the ways that you want them to work with this system. Without further ado then, I'm going to go ahead and pull up the Management Studio software that we introduced in the basic admin course, and I'm going to go ahead and get ourselves logged in so we can do some administrative programming. Just like in that basic admin course, the profile that I'm going to use for today's programming purposes is the sysadmin profile. This is the one profile that's there for you right out of the cardboard. So sysadmin is the username, SYSADMIN, and sysadmin is also the password. Once again, if you have a profile that has full administrative access, by all means you can log in with that username and password combo. However, if you do not have a profile with that level of access, the sysadmin is what you're going to want to log into for today's programming purposes. And that once again brings us right back to this administrative view of the system where we do all of the administrative configurations. The one area that I want us to focus on to get started here today is our Active Directory integration folder. If your company uses Active Directory for the creation and maintenance of your user profiles, you can go ahead and expand out the Active Directory tab, and you can click on the Configuration tab below. Here is all of the things that you will need to program in order to sync our server up with Active Directory so that we can pull in the user information and save you some time on the setup and creation of your user profiles. Configuring Active Directory is actually a pretty quick and easy thing to program. First and foremost, you'd want to come to the right-hand side, and top to bottom, if you want to use that Active Directory integration, you would first enable Active Directory. If you wanted your users to be able to log in directly to the server if Active Directory were down, you can also set this permission where they could go ahead and log into our Management Studio software without the necessity to have Active Directory running. The next field for fully qualified domain name is just that. You just need the domain name for your company. We don't need to point it to any specific server or location. We're going to type in the generic domain name, something like abccompany.com or oasis.com. This is just the domain name for your area. Once you type in the domain name, we'll be able to go track down the specific location that we need to connect to. So just put in the domain name for your organization. The next feature for group search and using the matching rule and chain logic, this feature allows Tracer to basically send a single request to Active Directory, and Active Directory does all the work for us in terms of searching through the directory. This helps to greatly cut down on network bandwidth and other server resources. I would recommend that you use this feature. And last but not least, you type in the user property names, the other information that we need to sync in with your Active Directory. Once this information is plugged in, you go down to the lower right-hand corner and click Save. That will give us all the information that we need to sync into your Active Directory system. Now, if we're using Active Directory for your company, there are two ways that we can roll out the profiles to your individuals and get the necessary information into our software. The first way is that you can send the download software link out to every individual in your company that's going to have access to the Tracer software, and only those individuals that you want to have access to the Tracer software. They can download the Management Studio, they can change their login type to a Windows authentication, and they can type in their username and password. Once they log in the first time, Active Directory will then send us all the information about them and fill out the basic user template for the individual, wherein it will put their username, their description, their password, their email address, and their associated extension, so long as all that information is programmed in your Active Directory. That's going to significantly save you having to create all that individual for each individual inside of your company. The other way that you can get the information in, and just the other method by which you might want to leverage this Active Directory, you can, when it comes time to create user profiles, open up the user profile screens and simply type in their username and description as it would match an Active Directory. At which point you can go ahead and go about the permission setting of those individuals without filling in the email address, the extension, the password, or any other variable that we're going to get from Active Directory. When that person then logs in the first time, once you do choose to deploy that Management Studio out to them, we will then extract the information from Active Directory and fill out the remaining fields. So your choices are twofold: send them out the software, have them log in, at which point we will extract, and then you can go about the permission granting process, or just fill in the base characteristics, that username and description for each individual, continue with the permission granting process. When then the person logs in the first time, it'll extract at that point the additional information from Active Directory. That then is how we integrate some of the nuances of our Active Directory integration. It's a great little time saver tool, it really does help, and our system profile will now abide by all your Active Directory rules. So if you have passwords update every 60 days, 30 days, or at any other interval, that will automatically transcend to our system, and we will abide by those same Active Directory controls. So that then's how we use Active Directory inside of the organization. Simple point two with this configuration tab, we'll get our system up and running. The next major topic that I wanted us to start discussing, kind of getting into the more granular programming side of the system, is down here in this List and Other Resources area. Specifically, if we expand out List and Other Resources and expand out the first subgroup underneath, which is Lists, I wanted to do a quick orientation with these different list types. These list types are going to be our discriminators when it comes time to grant permissions to employees inside of our organization with the calls that he or she is supposed to be able to listen to. Now, before we take a look at the specific list types, I want to set this into a little better context for you. So let me give you some idea of how this will work for you out of the box. As soon as your system's installed, we can give permissions to two groups within your organization to any given person. The first group is called My Calls, and that is a very common configuration, especially for your Joe and Jill taxpayer types. A lot of companies we work with want those lower level individuals to be able to listen to their calls and their calls only. So if they do forget a meeting time, a callback number, or email address, they can go back and revisit the calls that they were personally a party to and those recordings only. They don't get to listen to their colleagues, their managers, their supervisors, or anybody else inside of the organization. The opposite extreme out of the box is that we can give permissions to all calls. Again, another very common configuration for most industries. Typically, there's at least one person inside of any company, if not multiple people, that get to listen to anything and everything without discrimination. If it was recorded, I want to be able to have access to it. Your presidents, your vice presidents, the people in the hierarchy of the organization. Because of its commonality, that's another really quick and easy configuration inside of the software. In fact, if all of your employees fall into one of these two umbrellas, you're ready to go right out of the cardboard. You do not need to create any additional lists and call filters for the sake of programming permissions. If, however, you do have some people that are middle of the road, that's when you would want to create these groupings inside of the software. So let's say, for example, very generically, that we have a sales manager, and the sales manager needs to be able to listen to the sales team's calls. Well, inherently, that doesn't have any value inside of the Tracer system whatsoever. If we tell it to let you listen to the sales team's calls, it's going to look back at us with a blank stare, not have a clue what we're talking about. So that's when we need to come into the software and define specifically who is in that sales team. Once we've defined that sales team, we can then go about granting permissions to just those recordings to any given individual within the organization. So that's when we would need to create some groupings ahead of time, is if you have employees in that middle of the road extreme that just need to listen to a specific segment of calls within the organization. So that being said, there are quite a few different discriminators that you can use to pick and choose which calls any given person is going to be able to listen to. The types of discriminators that we have are listed here underneath lists. In fact, let me give you a rundown of some of the more common ones so that you can know which ones maybe would be best used for your organization. Very commonly, people base this discrimination on ACD information. If you use automatic call distribution to route the calls inside of your company, we can use that as our discriminator. Something like, "Thank you for calling Oasis. For sales, press 1. For customer support, press 2. We could have people only listen to calls that go to the customer service queue or the sales queue. Or I could tell somebody that they can listen to all the calls that go to Bob, Betty, and Steve and Tyler's agent IDs who log into the tech support queue. However we want to discriminate based on that ACD routing, that can be a way that we pick and choose which calls you have access to and which calls you don't have access to. ANI, which is essentially caller ID, is another common one. Based on the phone numbers that we see dialing in, I can give permissions. You can listen to all the calls to or from your husband or wife's cell phone number, your kid's dorm room. You can listen to all the calls from our VIP customer. Based on the caller ID information that we see, that can be our discriminator. DID DNIS number, very similarly, these are the numbers that are being dialed to reach your company. So whatever your customers are plugging in to get a hold of your organization, that can pick or choose what you get to listen to. You can listen to all the calls that come in on the main number, but you don't get to listen to any of the calls that come in on the backdoor number that only our friends and family would know about. So based on what they're plugging in, that's your discriminator. Another really common one is schedule lists, based on times of day. So if you have graveyard shift managers who want to listen to the graveyard shift calls and morning shift managers that want to listen to the morning shift calls, we can segment it out by the period of the day. Also commonly, any information that you would attach to a call, probably by way of that little desktop client piece where we can attach information in real time to a recording. That can be our discriminator as well. So if I'm labeling a call as having an upset customer on it, or a bomb threat, or this is a call where someone demanded a refund, that information that I attach to the recording can pick and choose who gets to listen to the call. I would probably let my customer service manager listen to all the calls where people were upset because those are calls that would be important for him or her to be able to listen to. And last but not least, the one that I see probably most commonly, overwhelmingly so, is extension lists. Within most companies, traditionally people sit at the same extension day in and day out. So it's very common for me to use extensions, the actual key set that they sit at, to pick and choose which calls someone would get to listen to and which calls they don't get to listen to. I'll let you listen to all the calls that go to Bob, Betty, Steve, and Tyler's extensions, but you don't get to listen to any of the calls that go to the president's extension or the HR extensions. Really, it doesn't matter which flavor you choose. They're all perfectly viable. Any of these flavors you'd want to pick on are created very much the same way. You choose that list flavor of interest, highlight it, and on the right-hand side, you click the plus icon. So in this case, let's go with extension list because of its commonality. Come to the right, click the little plus icon, and I get a box where I can now set up a group of extensions. I can call it anything I want. For a description, I might call this Eric's calls. These are all the calls that Eric should be able to listen to, based on their extensions. I could make it very cookie cutter. I could call this the sales team. In fact, that's what we'll go with today, just kind of fitting the theme here. Here's a cookie cutter group of all the sales extensions in the company, and I can let my sales managers and people interested in sales calls listen to these calls that happen on these extensions. Regardless of the title that you give, it really doesn't matter. What you'd want to make sure that you do is click the little checkbox underneath to make a matching call filter for the list. That call filter is actually what we're going to use for programming purposes, so very important that you click that checkbox. Once you fill out those two things, you hit save, and it'll now create a very generic team over in that little extension list area. In fact, if I expand out extension list, you will see that sales team just kind of waiting in the wings here. And now I need to give it some definition. So this is the last phase of creating these groupings. You click that newly created group, and on the right-hand side, you can now populate specifically who's part of this group. Now, with extension lists, we get two columns. In the far right-hand column, these are all the extensions inside of my organization. The left-hand column, these are the members of this group, which right now has 0. So what we're going to do is peruse these extensions in the right-hand column. Let's find some actual humans here. Grab those people of interest. I'm going to grab a few people randomly. And you kick them over to the left-hand side. So just that easily, I defined who all's in my sales team. My sales team consists of these 5 extensions. Whenever I talk about the sales team, I'm talking about Eric, Doug, Julie, Elwood, and Chuck. If I give anybody access to the sales team's calls, they're going to be able to listen to all the recordings that happen on those 5 extensions. And those 5 extensions alone. They wouldn't get to listen to Will. They wouldn't get to listen to Greg. I'm picking and choosing specifically who's a member of the group so that I can give access to those calls and those calls alone. That's really all there is to the creation of the groups. Once we've given them some definition, they're now ready for programming purposes. One thing that I do want to mention though, this process is not particularly rigid. If you create a customer service manager down the road, as we'll be taking a look at here in just a few moments, and you realize that you never created a customer service team after the fact, by all means, you can come back here to the list types, create the customer service team on the fly, revisit that customer service manager's profile, and grant him or her access to those specific recordings. So there's a lot of flexibility in how these work. However, I think creating these groups ahead of time is a really good idea because it just makes the process flow all that much smoother. So as you're thinking about who's going to have access to your system and which recordings those individuals are going to be able to listen to, just start formulating these groups and you'll have them waiting in the wings. So now when I create the customer service manager or the sales manager, I'll be able to grab that group, kick it over on the fly, quick and easy, they have access to that specific group of calls. So there is a lot of flexibility. I just think this makes the process go a little bit quicker. Once you then created all of those lists that are going to be of interest to you, the area that we're going to live for the rest of this course is going to be down here in the users and permissions area. Much as its folder name implies, users and permissions where we start creating user profiles and where we start doling out those permissions. So this is where we're going to get everybody in your company set up to use the Tracer software as you want them using the Tracer software. To get that process started, we'll expand out users and permissions, and we're going to click on the first little subgroup underneath here, which is users. Here is where we start creating those profiles. Now, as you notice, right out of the box, we have 2 user profiles already created for you. We have the sysadmin, that's who we're logged in as right now. Without that profile being there, we wouldn't be able to get very far. And we also have the sysreporter. Sysreporter, you can acknowledge and disregard in the same breath. That's a profile that's only ever going to be used for looking at logs and troubleshooting purposes. A typical user would never log in as the sysreporter. So don't worry about that profile being there, nothing of great significance. If you have created some additional profiles, or if your reseller helped you create some additional profiles in the software, you'll also see those listed in this table to the right. Nice little time saver, because those are 1 or 2 less profiles that you're going to have to create. My system, though, is fresh out of the cardboard. So we're going to have to create the first profile together. I assure you, creating the first profile looks identical to creating the second, the 5th, or the 500th. It's a very uniform process across the board, so don't think I'm shortchanging you whatsoever. With users highlighted, you go to the right-hand side, you click the little plus icon, and that'll pop a template. This template is what you fill out to create your individual user profiles. You will need to fill out this template for every single user that's going to have access to your Tracer software. However, you do not need to fill it out for people who are simply being recorded. If you have a bunch of people inside of your software who are simply being recorded and never have any intention of using the software in any way, shape, or form, they do not need a profile created. However, if they're going to use the historical call interface, the desktop client to attach information to calls, live call interface, reports, or any other perspective of the software, they would need to have this profile created for them. The one exception to having to fill out this profile in any way, shape, or form are people using Active Directory. If you push the link where they can download that Management Studio and they log in the first time, these profiles will be created for them by Active Directory. This information will be auto-populated. The other side of the Active Directory integration If you're creating profiles ahead of time so that they're completely ready to go and fully permitted when the person logs in the first time, what you would need to do is type into the username the exact username that they would find in Active Directory. So in this case, let's create Bob Smith. Get this process started. If that's how we look in Active Directory, and his description in Active Directory is also, just a chance for redundancy here, Bob Smith, those are the only two pieces of information that you would really need to fill out on this template. You might also want to adjust the user type, which is something we'll get to in just a moment here, but that's all you would have to fill out if you're using the Active Directory integration. Rest of this information will get filled in for you automatically when Bob Smith would log in for the first time. For all others not using Active Directory, here's how we fill out the template. Don't worry, it's a very quick and easy process. We can crank through these in about 30-40 seconds apiece. Username is what the person's going to log into the software as. If you're not using Active Directory, you're not bound by anything whatsoever. So make this username whatever makes good sense to you and your employees. In this case, first, last name works pretty well. We'll leave it at this. This is what the user is going to log into the software as. The description field below, this is what we're going to reference this person as an administrator. Some companies, they'll have 20 Bob Smiths on payroll, so we have to say Bob Smith the tall guy, or Bob Smith who sits in front of Becky's office. Whatever you'd need to find this person's profile again if you ever needed to make any adjustments. Assuming you only have one Bob Smith on payroll, leave it at Bob Smith. I think you're going to be just fine and dandy. The next thing that we'll need to fill out is the email address. Now, you don't have to have email address, so you certainly can leave this field blank, but if you're going to use any of the email functionality, passing around evaluation notifications, call notifications, sending out WAV files, or anything else to your email address, it's good to have this email address waiting in the wings just to simplify that process when it comes time to use any of those email functionalities. So, good idea. Plug it in here. We'll make this one quick and easy. bob@aol.com. Doesn't have to be your company email address. Whatever they're going to check most regularly, plug in any valid email. The same to an extent holds true for password. It's optional. You can password protect if you would like. You cannot password protect if you would not like. But by all means, plug in some sort of a password, verify that password underneath. That username and password are the two most important things from this template in terms of memory. Be sure to jot those down, write them on a sticky note. That's how the person's going to log into the system. If you don't give those appropriately to the individual, their profile is not going to do them a darn bit of good. When it comes to password, these can be as complex or as simplistic as you would like. So if you want to make it simply one character, it can be one character. If you don't want to put a password in there at all, you don't have to put a password in there at all. If you want to make it 16 characters, uppercase, lowercase, numbers, symbols, you can make it whatever you would like. We are not going to bind you to any sort of a password, so make it as simplistic or as complex as you want it to be. As mentioned previously with Active Directory integration, if you are updating your passwords commonly, every 30 days, 60 days, those will also update with the Oasis profile, so those profiles will also be governed by any password change. Other things to use at your discretion. Down below, you can allow the user to change his or her password. You can even require that they change the password on first login. So if you want, you could certainly make their password something quick and easy, like 1234. When they log in the first time, they could then make that password anything that they want it to be, so that you no longer know what it is as the administrator, and so it's uniform with all their other passwords they use for all their other applications. The next little feature, also a neat little tool here that you can use at your discretion, user account expires on. If you know the person's going to leave in the foreseeable future, maybe they're a 1099 contractor or somebody who puts in their 2 weeks notice today, I can come into their account and I can set it to expire. So let's say Bob here put in his 2 weeks notice. He's going to be leaving on the 22nd. What that would do is then just make his profile invalid. When he goes to log in anytime beyond the 22nd, it will simply deny that request. He will no longer have access to listen to or work with recordings. If you don't know when the person's going to leave, just leave that unchecked. We can certainly come in here and delete their profile anytime manually. That's very quick and easy. In fact, as a side note, margins of the page, deleting somebody's profile literally requires that you just find their profile name here in this grid, click the delete button, they're purged out of there in about 3 seconds. But that is something that you would manually have to remember to do if you haven't set their user account to expire, assuming that you no longer want them to have access to the system. Is remote, next little option that we have below, this is a really big one for users who are going to be outside of your local area network. So maybe they're traveling salespeople or people who work from their home office. Anybody that's not on your local network, if you want them to have access to the Tracer system from wherever in the world they might be, the sunny beaches of the Bahamas, the Starbucks in Hong Kong, we can set them up with remote access wherein they can do anything from a remote location that they could do sitting under your roof. That does require a little bit of network programming on the installation side, but assuming that network programming has taken place, we can give them a tunnel by which they can get into the Tracer system. If you have not labeled their account as remote, they would only be able to access it on the local network. If they try to log in from some remote location, even with that network set up appropriately, it would block their request, say, nope, Bob, you're only allowed to log in from your local IP address. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. Talk to you on Monday. So is remote is nice if you want people accessing the system from outside of your local network. The next determination that we have to make is the user type. This is probably the biggest choice that we're going to make on the screen. Also worth mentioning for those who are leveraging Active Directory. When your employees log in via Active Directory and we pull in the information, they are always going to be labeled as a knowledge worker user type. That's the default. If you want them to be some other type of user, have extra bell and whistle access, the ability to work with other perspectives, you would have to come in here and manually change their user type to grant them access to those different interfaces. By default, all users on any integration will also be set up the same way. You are a knowledge worker. To give you a better idea of what these user types do, let's just take them from top to bottom, and I'll give you a quick little explanation of each. A knowledge worker is your base level employee. This is the most simplistic profile for everyday people inside of the organization. They can have access to historical calls, and they can use the desktop client to start and stop recordings and attach information to recordings in real time. That's all they get to do. You are working with call recordings in the traditional sense. I need to do he said, she said games, verifications. I'm working with recordings for knowledge purposes. That is our knowledge worker. Base level employee has access to work with recordings. We haven't yet defined which recordings they're going to have access to. Maybe it's just their own, maybe it's everybody, maybe it's somewhere in between, but all they can do is work with historical calls. A guest user is different from the other three. This one is traditionally somebody outside of your organization, maybe a VIP customer or a traditionally upset customer who you need to share calls with on occasion. They don't have any inherent access to the system. They don't have any calls that they get to listen to by default. But on occasion, when I find a recording that they would need to listen to, because maybe they're having a complaint or there's some sort of discrepancy in the order, I can share them the recording, they can listen to it if I've chosen to pass it their direction. That's your traditional guest user, somebody outside of the organization that would need to have access to recordings from time to time. Getting back to internal employees. A call agent is essentially a knowledge worker, but a call agent gets 2 extra abilities on their profile. First off, they can grade their own recordings. So if you're using our employee evaluations for reflective grading purposes, a call agent can go into the software and they can grade themselves. Was I happy on the call? Was I friendly? Was I able to make the sale? Whatever it is that you want to have them grade themselves on, we can set up an evaluation. They can do reflective grading. Gives you as the manager or supervisor some perspective as to how well they think they're doing on the phone when they're on the calls. The other thing that a call agent gets to do, when they work with the desktop client, a call agent has this extra component built on for coaching purposes. A knowledge worker does not get this little section of the desktop client. When a knowledge worker downloads the desktop client, they get the ability to start and stop recordings. They also get the ability to attach information to calls, but that's it. When a call agent downloads it, they get that extra coaching conversation option where I can get into a coaching session or an instant message session, and I can chat back and forth with the supervisor who could help me through a recording. That's one of the big discriminations. If you don't want somebody to have the chatting ability, you would set them up as a knowledge worker. If you do want them to have the chatting ability, you would set them up as a call agent. Just depends on your personal preferences. Aside from that, the same functionality as a knowledge worker. They can listen to historical calls, they can play them back, they can review those he said, she said games, and work with calls for knowledge purposes. Last but not least is your call manager type. The call managers are your grand poombas. These are the people that get to do everything. They can work with all the different perspectives. They can use all the bells and whistles. They can listen to calls historically, all calls that are all said and done for verification. They can listen to calls in real time with Live Call Monitor. They can run reports. They can fill out evaluations. Not so much about themselves, though they can, but more importantly about those people that they supervise. So I can go in and grade Bob, Betty, Steve, Tyler, and Jill's calls and tell them how well I think they're doing on those recordings. So Call Manager is your highest level class. One last mentionable about these different user types. Knowledge workers, guest users, call agents. You can have as many of them as you want. You could set up 500 of each. They can all log in. They can work with the system in the ways that they're allowed to work with the system. Not a problem whatsoever. Call Manager works on a different license count though. You can only have as many call managers logged into the system at any given time as you have available call manager licenses. Every server that we ship has a different number of those call manager licenses inherently built to it. Those are also available a la carte. But those are going to work on a first come, first served basis. So let's say your system has 3 call manager licenses available. You can set up 10 call managers inside of your organization to use all those extra features of the software. The issue being that only 3 would be able to log in at any given time. Once a 4th tries to log in, he or she would get an error message. You've exceeded your call manager license count, at which point they would have to wait until one of the first 3 logs off, freeing up a license before they could log in. So they're not statically tied to the user's profile. Those do come on a first come, first served basis, but you can only have as many call managers logged into the system at any given time as you have those available call manager licenses. If you would ever find that you need additional call manager licenses, you can certainly feel free to be in touch with your reseller, and we can load that server up with as many call manager licenses as would be necessary. So those are the different user types that we have in the software. What you want to do is determine for this user what features they're going to need to have access to. I'm going to go ahead and make Bob Smith here a call manager. We're going to give him the full-blown access so that I can show you all the various permission windows that someone might or might not need to have access to and how we would go about giving permissions for each of those different interfaces. Once you've made that user type determination, the next thing that we need to do is identify some things about this user. We can identify their agent ID if they log into ACD groups, a DNIS number if they have a phone number that's dialed to reach them specifically inside of the organization, and we can also identify them by an extension. Those little variables are what's going to determine what are my calls. So when we talked about my calls earlier, this is where we see what a my call consists of. Anytime we see one of these 3 things on a recording, we're going to know that that was Bob's call. We're going to give him immediate access to listen to those recordings. So we want to go ahead and fill in as many of these things are applicable. So if he has an agent ID that he uses to log into an ACD group, we can plug that in. Agent 1025, whenever we see that agent on a call, we're going to know Bob was on that recording. We'll give him access to the call. If he has a phone number that's used to reach him specifically in the company, give you a nice Hollywood number here. If that phone number is dialed to reach Bob specifically inside of the company, every time we see that number dialed, I'll give Bob access to that recording. We know he was on the call. And then last but not least, we can also associate his profile with an extension. This is just the extension that he or she would sit at day to day. Use the first one available here, extension 1000. Now you might have noticed for agent ID, DNIS number, and for this extension, we can set what's called an effective date. Effective dates are very handy if you're recycling extensions or agent IDs often, maybe because you have high turnover, or maybe because we just ran out of extensions to use. If we want to recycle an extension or any of these variables, we choose effective date and they would only be able to work with the calls from that date forward. So if Susie was at extension 1000 prior to Bob getting hired, I can say, all right, you only get to listen to calls that hit extension 1000 from today forward, Bob. You have no business listening to the calls that happened when Susie was still here occupying extension 1000. So that effective date can come in handy if you are recycling those extensions or any of these other variables. If some of these things don't exist, you can simply leave these fields blank. They're not mandatory. They're just there in case there are those different identifiers for the user. So in retrospect, when you look back at the template, there's not a whole lot of information you really need to fill out. Give them a username, plug in the email address, password information, make a class determination, and throw in some identifiers. That's why I said earlier that there's really not a whole lot to these, and you can crank them out in about 30 to 40 seconds a piece once you get on a roll. Having created that little template, you go ahead and hit save, and that'll create Bob inside of the software. At this point, he's just a shell of a man, but he is inside of our little users dropdown. There's Bob Smith. He has a very generic user profile built inside of the tracer. In the very last phase of the game, we're going to go about setting his permissions, telling him specifically what he gets to do, more importantly, what he doesn't get to do inside of the software. However, before we get to that, there's one last little thing I want to share with you in the margins of the page, and that's this user group utility that I talked about in the introduction. User groups are a great little time saver tool. Essentially, what they allow you to do is clump together similar users of the software so that you can go about setting their permissions in one fell swoop without having to individually go back to each and every person's profile, because that can get kind of tedious. So if you have several people inside of the organization that are going to use the software identically, we can stick them all into one user group and just set their permissions across the board. Here's how this would work. If you highlight user groups down below, come over to the right, you can click the little plus icon, and we can add a new group of users into the software. Really all we need to do here is give it a bit of a name. So today we'll go with managers. All my managers are going to use the software exactly the same way inside of the system. Go ahead and hit save, and that'll create a little shell of a group for you. In fact, if we expand out user groups, their managers will be, at which point we can start defining who's part of our manager team. And to do this, all you have to do is find those users that you've previously created those shell profiles for, grab them from the right-hand column, and move them over to the left-hand column. Now we've just identified that Bob is a member of this group. And we might throw over a bunch more people once we create their profiles in the software. Throw over Kim and Bob and Steve and Tyler and Joe, anybody and everybody that would be a member of this manager's group. Having put them all in the same group, we can now set their permissions across the board identically. Now, instead of showing you how to set permissions for a group, in this course I'm actually going to show you how to set permissions for an individual user. But I will revisit this group at the very tail end and show you that that process is identical. So if you can set permissions for one individual, you can also set permissions for a group. They are 100% the same. First run through, it might make a little more sense as we pick on one individual though, so that's the format that I'm going to choose. The only other things I want to point out while we're on the topic of user group are these that are in brackets right out of the cardboard. You'll notice we have quite a few bracketed user groups that are there just as soon as we boot up the server for the first time. The top 5 are just identifiers. So we can come in and we can see how many people were created for any given user group. So I can see how many call managers we have, just one, Bob Smith. I can see how many guest user profiles we've set up in the software. I can see how many knowledge workers have been created. So if you're running into that error message that you've exceeded call manager licenses somewhat often, you can click on call managers and see how many of those you set up in the first place. If more people are in this members column than are necessary, we could give them a different class so that they're not using the licenses when they log in. So these are good indexes just to see who's in your system of those various user types. The bottom 2, however, are great functional shortcuts. Power users and system administrators, really neat tools. What they do is give grand access to the software. If you click on power users and we grab somebody from the right-hand column, kick them over to the left-hand column, they immediately become a full-blown power user of the software, which means they have unrestricted access to the user interfaces. They can listen to all calls. They can use all bells and whistles. They essentially have God-level profile permissions inside of the software. There's nothing that they can't do on the user interfaces. Same thing holds true for system administrators. If you want somebody to have full-blown unrestricted access to the administrative side, we can make them a system administrator. All you need to do, find their profile on the right, kick it over to the left, they immediately have unrestricted administrative permissions. So actually just that easy, by clicking Bob Smith over into this power user and system administrator group, he is unrestricted. His profile can do everything. Most companies, I would generally recommend that you have at least one person, if not multiple people, who have this unrestricted access. So that way, if anybody's having an issue with the system, they can't figure out how to make something work, you log into your profile. If you can't do it, it can't be done. If you can do it, they're probably just having some sort of a permissions issue, so you can revisit their profile, check their permissions, and be sure to give them access to that feature that they need to be able to utilize. So stick somebody into power users, stick them into system administrators. You can do one or the other depending on which level of permissions you want to give, but if you grant both, you would have unrestricted access to the system. So I'm going to go ahead and kick Bob out of this system administrator and power user group. I don't want him to be the Grand Pumbaa. I want to more granularly be able to set up his permissions, but I did want to show those shortcuts because those are really neat tools, a quick way to give yourself unrestricted access. So with that being said, the last phase of the game that I want to get into in this course is the granular setting of permissions for Bob. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Bob Smith's profile, load his template over to the right, and we can start defining for him what he gets to do and what he doesn't get to do in the software. With that basic user template over to the right, I can always come in here and make any adjustments that would be necessary to Bob's profile. So if he gets a promotion and switches extension or updates his email address, I can always come in here and make minor changes to his profile. Assuming all of that information is just fine, I can go ahead and expand out his profile, and here's where we can really start drilling in. The first little subgroup I want to click on is application permissions. And here's where you get to define very generically what interfaces this user is going to be able to work with when it comes to the Tracer software. Now, if this person had been created as a knowledge worker, it's a nice little teachable moment for you. A knowledge worker would only be able to work with two interfaces of the software. He or she can work with the historical interface, that's called Tracer calls. That's where you can go to look for and listen to and work with calls that have been captured in the software. Of course, only those calls that you've been granted access to. A knowledge worker can also use live call permissions in that they can use the desktop client to start and stop their calls in real time and attach information to calls in real time, which are both live functionalities. If I tried to give a knowledge worker reporter permissions or agent and employee evaluation permissions, it wouldn't let me. Those are restrictions of his class. So no matter how I try to give him access to those interfaces, that's going to be a limitation. If this person's set up as a call agent, they would also get the extra functionality of those employee evaluations. Because as I mentioned earlier, a call agent has the ability to do reflective grading. So they can go into the system and they can use those reflective scorecards to grade their own performance on their recordings. If I tried to give that call agent reporter permissions, just like a knowledge worker, that would not work because that's a limitation of their class. Because Bob here is a call manager, I can also give him the reporter permissions where he can start running reports and getting access to statistics in the software. As a call manager also, this live call tab has more significance because he will be able to access a live call interface where he can listen to calls as they're taking place inside of the organization. That's another feature that's strictly for the call manager user types. So he has historical access, live call interface access, evaluations that he can use to grade himself, or more importantly, those people that he or she would supervise in the company. And last but not least, he also gets access to that reports interface where he can go to get some statistics and graphs and charts and aesthetically pleasing information about the system. The last perspective that's over here to the right is the Tracer admin view. This can actually be given to any user type. We don't discriminate who has admin access. However, be very careful who you give admin access to. The typical person is going to do much more damage than good on the administrative side. So I would generally recommend you give yourselves and the major IT people access to the admin view. That's about it. But you can give that admin access to anybody that you would like. Once you choose all those different perspectives you want the person to have access to, you go to the lower right-hand corner and you click Save. I'm moving all 5 of those over to the left so that we can take a look at each of these permission windows. When you expand out application permissions then, you'll see each of those permission windows listed underneath, and you can go about granting permissions for each of those different views. The one that I'm going to start off with is called Tracer Calls. Tracer Calls is our most complex permission window. Being able to listen to calls that are all said and done is our bread and butter. So this is where we give you the most bells and whistles, the most options that you can use while working with those recordings. But when you load any given permission window, essentially the same thing happens to the right. You get a series of checkboxes to set permissions for this interface, and you also get a series of tabs that can be navigated to really drill into what you want this person to do within the interface. So we're going to take this left to right, we'll show you all the different permissions, and then we'll show you all the different permission areas, which include reports and live calls and admins and evaluations. So drilling into Tracer Calls. The first tab that you see is the General tab. The General tab is essentially what bells and whistles this person's going to be able to use while working with recordings. We haven't yet defined which calls he's going to have access to in the first place, but this is what he's going to be able to do with those recordings. And they're broken into two general areas. We have folder permissions, which are essentially no harm, no foul. Folders are how we organize and store calls, make them easy to retrieve again in the future. Customizable per user, doesn't affect any other user how I store my calls, so I generally recommend you leave these as they are. Give it allow across the board, let them organize calls however they see fit. But more sensitive are the document permissions. Document permissions are where you want to err a little extra caution, because this gets to some sensitive stuff that you want to be careful about giving to some individuals. In particular, the first one, probably far and away the most important, the ability to delete documents. This is the ability to go back to the hard drive and delete recordings for all time, for everyone. It's not just from your own perspective, it affects every other user of the software. So be careful who you give that delete permission to. Way too easy to hide the evidence. That call will be gone for all time if they should choose to execute that delete. The next option that we have here, remove documents from document folders, speaks to this organization tree over to the left. If I've put a call into my important folder, and I realize 6 months down the road it's not really important at all, this would just give me the flexibility to take it out of that organized folder. I can unorganize that call, so no harm, no foul on that one. Generally allow that for everybody. Share documents with guest users. Given to everybody by default, one that you might want to take away, especially from your lower level employees. This is the ability to pass calls to those people on the outside world, those VIP customers, or any other individual that's been set up with a guest account. If the circumstance comes up where they need to share a call to the outside world, you might want Joe and Jill taxpayer telling their manager or supervisor about it. That would be the person who could execute the share. Otherwise, if you trust those individuals, you can leave that permission granted. They can pass calls to the outside world whenever the situation should arise. Change document expiration dates. This allows you to mark a call as particularly important. So if you think a call is going to come back to haunt you, you can set an expiration date for some distant time in the future. It'll be sure to override that call when it comes to backup and archive, and it will keep the call active on the server for whatever period of time that you've indicated. So I can tell the system to keep the call until the year 3000, and it'll do just that. Export call data to a CSV file. That's a comma-separated value file. Essentially looks and feels just like an Excel spreadsheet. And this will give you all the data about your recordings in a format that you can work with. So if you want to be able to cut and paste and manipulate the data about your calls, your outside caller information, your directions, your durations, things of that nature, this can give you that information in a tangible format where you can do things like make custom reports and just generally work with that information. The next option here is a really big one. The ability to export audio from documents to the file system and email. This allows you to convert your calls to standard audio formats. Your .mp3s, your .waves, any standard audio codec that's out there. So if you want to, you can save calls on your desktop in any format that you choose, at which point you can burn them to a CD, put them on your MP3 player, attach them to an email and send them to somebody, put them on YouTube. We don't really care. They would be your calls to do with what you will at that point, so feel free to work with them as you see fit. Playback screen recording associated with audio to which you have playback permission. If you are using our screen recording server, this can give you permission to see the screen recorded activity of your agents while they were on the phone. The screen recording server complements the audio recording server, and it takes screenshots of your agents' desktops while they're on the phone. If you have this permission, I can see what my agent was doing on their computer while they were talking away with the customer. Were they playing on Facebook? Were they playing solitaire? Or were they using internet resources appropriately, reading the script like they should be, typing in the customer information into the appropriate fields? It just gives me an exact capture of what they were doing on their computer that meshes up with the audio feed. And last but not least, we get this ability to create guest user accounts on the fly. So if you would happen to be out of the office on vacation, or maybe you're home sick, this would give the user the ability to create a guest user account if they needed to urgently get a call to somebody on the outside world. All they would need to do, plug in the user's name and their email address, and they could create a guest user account without needing full-blown administrative access to go in there and set up that guest user profile. Generally recommend that at least a couple people have that ability, assuming that you might be out of the office on some occasions. Once you set up these general permissions as you see necessary for the user, The next two tabs that we have work very similarly. Users and user groups. These define who the individual will be able to share calls with inside of the organization. Sharing a really neat feature of the software, wherein if I have a call that I need to get to somebody else, I can share it to his or her profile and bring it to their attention. Works a lot like Microsoft Outlook or whatever your email client might be. If I have an email I need somebody to read or a funny picture I want them to see, I can forward that over to their profile. It appears in their inbox. It's brought to their attention. Same functionality with our system, except we're passing recordings. So if I have a call I need you to listen to, I can forward it over to your profile. It is brought to your attention. You can then listen to that recording and hear what I need you to hear. So because of that universal functionality, by default, we give employees the ability to share calls with any other user of the software. You never know when you're going to get a call that's important from the receptionist all the way up to the president. So you can share with anybody by default. But if you want to, this is more about limiting that functionality. Maybe you don't want them to share with everybody. So by a group level or by an individual user level, I can take away that permission. You know what, Bob? I don't want you sharing calls with that Eric guy. Yeah, he's kind of a pest. The two of you will be gossiping at the water cooler all day long. So I can move that out of the permissions column, take away the ability to share calls with Eric, so I know I don't have to worry about those two chatting and gossiping all day. So if you want to, you can limit who the individual has the ability to pass calls over to and let them listen. Last but not least, what I consider the most important of the tabs. This is your call filters tab. Here's where you're going to define which calls the individual gets to listen to in the first place. Now, by default, every user gets the ability to listen to my calls. Those are the calls that we attributed to their profile, based on their agent ID, their DNIS number, or their extension. So inherently, they get to listen to calls that they were a party to. If you want to grant them additional permissions, you just find those groups in the far right-hand column that you would have created, and this is where those lists come into play that we started off creating earlier, and you kick them over to the left-hand side. So out of the cardboard, as I promised, there's all calls. I can kick over all calls. Just that easy. This individual can listen to anything and everything that was ever recorded inside of the system. If I don't want them listening to all calls, I can find any other groups that would be over here, kick them to the left, and they can listen to then those recordings. So now he can listen to himself and all of the calls that happen on those 5 extensions that we defined as being part of the sales team. And I can kick over as many groups as are necessary. A list of phone numbers, times of day, account codes, any sort of groupings that I want to give this person access to, I just move them over to the permissions 2 column. Everything that's in the permissions 2 column represent the calls that he or she would be able to listen to. This is also the phase in the game where I said there's a lot of flexibility. So if you realize that, gosh darn it, I never created a customer service team and I need to give this person access to only the customer service extensions, you can then revisit that lists and call filters area, create a customer service team, revisit this tab, and then grant the person access to just that group of extensions. So lots of flexibility, but if you had created those groups ahead of time, they're just going to be waiting in the wings. You kick them to the left, life is good. So now we've told him which calls he has access to, what he can do with those recordings, and who he can share them to. His tracer calls permissions are set. Right-hand corner, click Save. That's all she wrote. He's now a full-blown user of that historical calls interface. The rest of the permission windows work very similarly. Go from top to bottom here. If I want to give this person access to run reports, again, only a perspective that call manager types would be able to use, I can come in here and I can grant him reporter permissions. This is much more simplistic. On the General tab, can I report on my own calls? Sure. Where's the harm in that? Report definitions is the big difference here. This is where you define which reports the person's going to have access to. Generally speaking, if you're a call manager, you have access to all the different report styles. But to give you some definition, there are basically 3 types of reports that we have. Customer interaction reports are all about ad campaigns. So if you're tracking your various marketing efforts, these are the different reports that you can run on those DNIS numbers or on those campaigns that you're tracking. Employee assessment reports are all about employee evaluations. So if you're using our scorecards to grade an employee's calls, this is where you can get all the information about those evaluations. And last but not least, tracer usage are your generic phone system statistic reports. We call this tracer usage, and we can get reports on extension activity, call times, call durations, general information like that about your phone system. If you wanted to hide any one of those packages, all you would need to do is kick those templates over to the right. I can move them out of here. Now this person cannot run any reports about ad campaigns, but he has all the other ones available. Or I can just leave them as they were, and he can run any report that his heart desires. What's most important, though, is once again this Call Filter tab. Who can I run those reports on? If I want him to have unrestricted access to all the data in the company, kick over all calls, he can run reports on anybody he wants and any style of report that his heart desires. But I can be restrictive here. You know what? You can only run reports on the sales team. I only want you to see the information about those 5 extensions. You have no business seeing what the president's doing all day long. So based on those call filters, you can tell him what information he has access to in the first place, and then he can still run any report that his heart desires. Happy with how this tab's set up? You go ahead and hit save. Now this person can use reports just as you want them to use reports. Agent and employee evaluation. This is a permission window that's only viable once you've created a scorecard inside of the software. If you're interested in learning how to create a scorecard, there's an advanced Tracer Administrator course which focuses on how to create evaluations inside of the software, among other topics. If you have already created a scorecard, you'll be able to use this permission window. The General tab tells them how they can use the evaluations. First off, we allow them to see the scorecards when they go looking for them. And secondly, we give them additional function where they can email those evaluations to other individuals if after grading they want to bring that scorecard to somebody's attention. Maybe to the attention of the person that they graded, maybe to the attention of the manager or supervisor or president of the organization. But what's most important on this one is the Evaluations tab. And here's where you determine which scorecards somebody would be able to use, which cards they wouldn't be able to use, and how they would be able to use those scorecards. Once you create those evaluations, they'll be queued up here in the No Permissions column. You'd simply kick over the scorecards that are appropriate for this individual. So if you've created a sales scorecard, you'd move the sales scorecard over for the sales manager to use. If you've created a customer service scorecard, you might move the customer service scorecard over for the customer service manager to use. Once you've determined which scorecards they can use, you can go about setting their permissions. We have self-level grading, we have supervisor-level grading. So this is telling them to what capacity they can use those scorecards. For your typical call agents, you would only want them to do reflective grading. So you would set their permissions up to be able to evaluate themselves and probably nothing else. You don't want them to see other colleagues' scores. You don't want them to see the scorecards as a supervisor would, nor do you want them to see the grades that those supervisors have given to others. But as a manager, you'd probably want to give them full allows. If they wanted to, they could grade themselves, but more importantly, they can use this scorecard to grade other people, those people that they supervise, and tell them how well they think they're doing on the calls. So this permission window is first dependent on having created a scorecard. Once that scorecard's set up, you just tell them how they're going to be able to interact with that scorecard. Once you've set all those determinations, hit save. They'll be able to use just those scorecards you want them to use and only in the way that you want them to use them. The last of the everyday user profile permission windows that we have is Tracer Live Calls. Now, Tracer Live Calls is kind of a hybrid permission window. It pertains to knowledge workers and call agents with 3 of the checkboxes that you see, and it pertains to call managers with all of the remaining checkboxes that you'll see. So this is a hybrid because all 3 of those user types get to work with calls in real time to some capacity. This is where we've put all those permissions in. So as we look through this, I'll draw the distinctions for the different user types and how people will be affected. The first 2 that we have on the General tab are going to affect your call manager types. These are for the people who are going to be logging in and listening to calls in real time. They can be tracked when listening to calls if we allow that permission, which essentially keeps a log of the calls that they've listened to in real time. And we can also allow them to email recordings that they're listening to in real time as well. So if I happen to be listening to a call that'll make a great training example, I can send a copy of this call to someone once it's been completed. The other 2 tabs on this general permission window pertain to your knowledge worker and call agent types in relation to how they use the desktop client. First and foremost, I can take away the ability for someone to exit the desktop client if I want to ensure that my knowledge workers and call agents have access to this application on every single phone call that they're engaged in. If I deny them the ability to exit this desktop client, as soon as they log in the morning till the second they log out at night, this tool will lend itself to them while they're on the phone. The other permission we can customize is whether or not they can show their recording status. That recording status button is this microphone button right here. It's grayed out on calls that are not being recorded and red on calls that are being recorded. But if you don't want your agents to know whether or not they're being recorded, we can simply hide that little microphone button. They would have no idea whether or not their calls are being recorded or not recorded in the first place. If it's none of their business, we hide that little microphone icon. They will just be left to guess at best. So those two permission checkboxes pertain to your knowledge worker and call agent types. Moving back to your call manager types, users and user groups, two types of permissions that work very similarly. This is the ability to deploy button banks to the users that you supervise. So if I want to hard code buttons to my agents' desktops, I can set up a button bank as a manager or supervisor, and I can hard code these buttons to those individuals' desktop clients. So if I want uniformity, I want consistency as my employees are using those buttons, I set up one master bank and I push it out to all those individuals. So I know every single one of them on the desktop client has exactly the same buttons as every other one inside of the company. No spelling errors, no mistakes as they were configuring the buttons. So that's what users and user groups allow for me to be able to push out buttons to individuals that I manage or supervise. You might set it up so the customer service manager can publish buttons to the customer service team, and the sales manager can publish buttons to the sales team. Last but not least, we once again have this call filters tab. Now, to get under our belt the knowledge workers and call agents quickly, there's one checkbox that's going to pertain to those knowledge workers and call agents. This is the third and final checkbox of importance to those user types. That's the ability to start and stop the recording of their calls. If you've set up your knowledge workers and call agents to be able to use this desktop client to start and stop the recording of their calls, this is a permission that you would have to grant them. You would have to give them the permission to start and stop the recordings, so when they pull up the desktop client, they can on the fly determine when their calls are recorded, maybe more importantly, when their calls are not recorded. If you do not want them to have that manual toggle ability, you would make sure to deny the ability for them to start and stop the recording of their calls with the desktop client, so that way you don't have to worry about them toggling out of that. At that point, it's your determination to be made. They can click that button until their finger falls off. Nothing's going to happen. Their calls are either always recorded or always not recorded. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. The rest of this little call filters permission tab pertains to the call managers in terms of which calls they're going to be able to work with in real time inside of the company. Through that live call perspective, which calls will they be able to listen to inside of the organization? Works similarly to all the others. If we want them to listen to all calls without discrimination in real time, we give them permission to all calls. If we would only want them listening to the sales team calls in real time, we would only grant them access to the sales team calls, giving them the permission to view and listen to those calls, maybe even giving them the permission to start and stop the recording of those calls, so impose their recording will on that conversation. Once you choose the appropriate groups that they can listen to in real time through that live call interface, you go ahead and hit save. Their permissions have been granted. They're now using that fourth and final perspective, that live call interface. Very last but not least, we can also give granular administrative permissions to your employees. Generally speaking, if somebody's going to be an admin, they're an all or nothing admin. You give them full administrative authority to do anything they need on the admin side, or you don't give them any admin access whatsoever, because they'll likely do more damage than good. Because of that dichotomy, most of the time people give admin permissions, they do it via the user group utility that we looked at earlier by sticking somebody into that system administrators group. If I put somebody in the system administrator group, they have full-blown, unrestricted access to do any sort of administrative configurations that they would need. However, if you want to, you can give granular administrative permissions. This general tab basically points to the different folder tree elements on the admin side that you'd want them to have access to. So I can allow them to create new users and user groups, work with this users and permissions folder, view and modify server settings, work with things like backup and archive and recording rules and more sensitive server configurations. I can allow them to work with lists and other resources where they can create some groups in the software. In a new addition to version 7 and beyond, I can also give them permission to exclusively create employee evaluations. So if they want to be able to set up some scorecards for the people that they supervise, I can give them permission to that as well. So pick and choose those features of the administrative side that you would want them to be able to interact with. Maybe because he's a manager, I'll let him create some scorecards for his department, but I really don't want him doing anything else on the administrative side. And last but not least, you can pick and choose whose profiles they can manipulate if you're giving them access to work with user profiles. You can do it individually by user, or you can do it by user group. What this determines is whose profiles they can adjust. So maybe the sales manager can manipulate the sales team's calls, but he or she has no business playing with the customer service team calls because the customer service manager has those set up just as he or she wants. So you can granularly tell them which profiles they can adjust by coming in here and picking those select individuals, either by those user groups, let them listen to all manager or adjust all manager profiles, or by individual user. Once you've set that granular administrative permission, go ahead and hit save. He's now set up as a partial administrator to the software as well. That's really all there is to it. We've gone through all the different permission windows for Bob. He can now use all those different interfaces exactly like we want him to be using those different interfaces. The last little things I want to share with you here. First off, I want to revisit those user groups because I want to show you that setting permissions for a user group looks identical to setting permissions for an individual user. So if you want to set user group permissions, you find those user groups that you would have defined. In this case, we'll revisit that managers group that we've stuck one person in, but we might choose to stick several people into. We expand that group once it's populated, click on application permissions, and we can choose which generic applications we want these people to work with. Looks very similar to an individual user. Once you've chosen those generic interfaces for everybody in this group, hit save, expand that out. Those permission keys will once again all be listed. Click on the respective key, it loads the permission window to the right. It looks absolutely identical to setting permissions for an individual. It's just that now we're doing it for an entire group of people. Instead of just picking on Bob, we're picking on everybody that we've defined as being part of this managers group. A couple things to note when it comes to setting up user groups. If in the future you hire a new manager and you immediately want that person to inherit the permissions of all the other managers, all you would need to do is create them a generic profile and then stick them into the group. Immediately, they would inherit the permissions of everybody that's already been designated as being part of that group. So, nice little shortcut for future employees that you would hire. Secondly, when it comes to permission trumping, whatever profile gives an individual the most permission is going to be the one that holds true. So if you would accidentally stick one person into several different groups, the group that gives them the most access to the software is the one that's going to be pertaining to that individual. Because of that nature, I would always recommend that you give your user groups the minimum level of permissions for everybody in that group. If you want to go back and assign some specific permissions to an individual, visit their individual profile and grant them those extra capabilities. As an example, let's say you give everybody in a group the ability to permanently delete documents, but you want to take that permission away from Ted. If you go back to Ted's profile and strip him of the ability, he's still going to have the ability because he's a member of a group that has that functionality. So instead, I would give everybody in the group no permission to delete calls and go back to the individuals who I want to have that permission and give them the extra functionality. So whatever gives them the most permissions is going to be the profile that holds true. Keeping that precaution in mind, user group utility, a great time saver tool, really can knock off a lot of the time that it takes when it comes to setting up profiles. And last but not least, for those who work with Active Directory, when we sync in user information, we will also sync in all the user groups that that person's a member of in your Active Directory index. Those groups will appear here as user groups of the software. However, they do not have any inherent permissions associated with them. So if you want, you can set up permissions via those user groups and they'll apply to everybody that's in the Active Directory group, but you would need to go about the manual setting of those permissions just like we have here for any other group that's created in the software manually. We don't know what level of permissions you want those groups to have, so while we import the group, you need to go about the manual assigning of permissions for the individuals in those groups. Once you set up those profiles, whether individually or via the user groups, that's really all there is to it. At that point, what I would recommend, send out the link where your employees can download the software. They can download the Management Studio and or the desktop client, depending on what their needs might be. When they go to log in, having downloaded those clients, it's going to ask them for their username and password. I'm going to go ahead and log in as Bob Smith just to prove that we actually did something here today. I don't believe we gave him a password, so I'll go ahead and hit OK and keep my fingers crossed. Very good. It's going to load us up in the software. It's going to take a while to come up the first time on the guitar, but once we get everything loaded, now I can start working around with the software. So click on All Calls I Can View. You'll see here that Bob Smith has access to 22,745 calls in the software. This is my historical interface. This is where I go to look for, listen to, and work with the calls that are all said and done. He also has access to the live call interface because he's a call manager. He can run reports in the software because he's a call manager. And he also has some very limited administrative access. So I am now logged in as Bob Smith, and I'm ready to conquer the world. So push that little download software link out to all the users. Probably do that via email. In the same email, provide them their username and password. They're ready to hit the ground running. Go out there and conquer the world. With that then, I'll draw our Tracer user creation class to a close. If you have any questions about the topics that were covered in this course, please feel free to visit our website at www.oasis.com or call into our main headquarters at 888-496-9040 and speak to a member of the training, sales, or tech support staff. Thank you very much again for participating in the course. We wish you the best of luck with your system and hope you have a great day.